unquote. Those remarks about the king of the New Deal contrast significantly with Mencken's position on Calvin Coolidge, a president admired by many conservatives for his patriotic rhetoric, friendliness to religion, and break from the earnest administration of progressives. Mencken did not admire Coolidge and punctured the myth that the president was an ordinary man. Coolidge was instead, quote, a darling of the gods. No other American has ever been so fortunate, unquote. Mencken also had little trouble mocking Coolidge's lack of energy in office. If the Depression had come on his watch, quote, Coolidge would have responded to bad times precisely as he responded to good ones by pulling down the blinds, stretching his legs upon his desk, and snoozing away the lazy afternoons, unquote. At the same time, Mencken's small government outlook found in Coolidge a, quote, government stripped to the buff, the realization of the Jeffersonian ideal. This was just fine because, as Mencken explained, as he explained one of his political axioms, quote, we suffer most not when the White House is a peaceful dormitory, but when it is a Jitney Mars Hill with a tin pot pall bawling from the roof, unquote. Americans had no thrills while Coolidge reigned, but neither were there any headaches. Coolidge, quote, had no ideas, but he was not a nuisance, unquote. If Mencken's judgments of American political history and suspicions of government line up with modern day conservatives, seldom noticed, especially by the conservatives who exclude Mencken from their camp, is a sensibility that ties Mencken even more closely to American conservatives. The so-called father of American conservatism, Russell Kirk, the author of the 1953 bestseller, The Conservative Mind, defined conservatism not by party affiliation or public policy. It was much more existential, even personal. In a 2018 article for the Atlantic Monthly, Matthew Continetti, author of a recent book on conservatism, The Right, the 100-Year War for American Conservatism, Continetti summarized Kirkian conservatism this way, quote, Kirk reminded readers for decades, conservatism resists precise definition. There is no conservative platform applicable to all people in all places at all times. Strictly speaking, conservatism is not a political philosophy and certainly not an ideology. Kirk wrote that in 1982. Rather, it is a way of looking at the civil social order. Kirk spent his life circling back to general principles of conservatism, apprehended through the study of notable conservative writers and statesmen. These include belief in transcendental moral order, support for social continuity, and adherence to the principles of prescription, prudence, variety, and imperfectibility. For what it's worth, in his book on the conservative mind, Kirk conceded that even H.L. Mencken had his conservative side displayed with eccentric virulence in Notes on Democracy. Michael Oakeshott, someone not generally invoked in these discussions, an English philosopher and defender of conservatism, had less skin in the game of American politics and perhaps explained the conservative disposition even better than those Americans who had to keep their eye on the ball of the Republican Party. In his essay on being conservative from 1956, Oakeshott wrote that the propensity to use and enjoy what is present rather than to wish or look for something else, or to delight in what is present rather than what was or what may be, was an important part of a conservative temperament. Being conservative, in other words, was to prefer the familiar to the unknown, the tried to the untried, fact, the actual to the possible, the near to the distant, the convenient to the perfect. What Mencken wrote about living in Baltimore, he was likely expressing the most conservative side of him, at least the way that Oakeshott writes about conservatism. A home, Mencken wrote, quote, is not a mere transient shelter. Its essence lies in its permanence, in its capacity for accretion and solidification, in its quality of representing in all its details the personalities of the people who live in it. In the course of years, it becomes a sort of museum, such as it is now, of these people. They give it its indefinable air, separating it from all other homes, as one human face is separated from all others. It is at once a refuge from the world a treasure house, a castle, and the shrine of a of a world of hierarchy of peculiarly private and potent gods. Mencken, and that was end of quote there. For Mencken, the lack of space in New York City is what compared it unfavorably to Baltimore. He wrote this about New York. The intense crowding in New York and the restlessness and happiness that go with it make it almost impossible for anyone to accumulate the materials of a home, the trivial, fortuitous, and often grotesque things that gather around a family as glories and debts gather around a state. The New Yorker lacks the room to house them. He thus learns to live without them. In the end, he is a stranger in the house he lives in. He is a vagabond. His notions of the agreeable become those of the vaudeville actors, unquote. What went with hearth was kith and kin, and for Mencken, friends were an extension of his home. In that essay, he also wrote this: human relations in such a place tend to assume a solid permanence. A man's circle of friends becomes a sort of extension of his family circle. His contacts are with men and women who are rooted as he is. They are not moving all the time, and so they are not changing their friends all the time. Thus, abiding relationships tend to be built up, and when fortune brings unexpected changes, they survive those changes, end of quote. Sounds like Mencken's a kind of moral philosopher. And he added metaphysics for effect. Quote, it is our fellows who make life endurable to us and give it a purpose and a meaning. If our contacts with them are light and frivolous, there is something lacking, and it is something of the very first importance. What I contend is that in Baltimore, under a slow moving and cautious social organization, touched by the southern sun, such contacts are more enduring than elsewhere, and that life in consequence is more agreeable, unquote. This was not the cosmopolitan, the iconoclastic, the debunking Mencken. This was the thoroughly domesticated and bourgeois Mencken. It is the Mencken most conservative and the one that displeases those on the left because in his observations about the basics of human existence, work, home, enjoyment, friendship, Mencken was the least radical. This was precisely the verdict of Rutgers University historian T.J. Jackson Lears all the way back in 1989. He complained that for all of Mencken's ability to offend the left and the right, the Baltimore was in the end firmly conventional, even Victorian. Yes, Lears conceded someone could view Mencken as the last liberal, the last genuine devotee of individual freedom, who refused to make that pragmatic genuflection to the bureaucratic authority, who refused to elevate technique over principle. Mencken remained committed to a classical Republican version of politics, the 18th century vision of Jefferson, Madison, and Adams. But, Lears adds, Mencken's mean-spiritedness was virtually the same as the narrow smugness of the urban bourgeois. Here, Lears, I'm quoting Lears. Mencken's was the narrow smugness of the urban bourgeois, addicted to his creature comforts and convinced that he had earned them through his superior ability. With the significant exception of a concern for civil liberties, Mencken's Jeffersonianism could be heard in any barbershop full of right-thinking citizens. His father had divided all mankind into those who paid their bills and those who didn't, and Mencken shared the old man's tight-fisted morality. The New Deal Mencken charge was a political racket based on the proposition that whatever A earns really belongs to B. A is any honest or industrious man or woman. B is any drone or jackass. That's a quote from Mencken. Mencken's obsession with the tyranny of the inferior man blinded him to mass suffering, even in a Great Depression. Few, if any, starve, Mencken wrote. He was as much a defender of Victorian complacency as a rebel against it. Whatever you make of Lear's explanation of Mencken, his larger point about American politics should not be missed. Mencken was a classical liberal of the 18th century variety, of Enlightenment variety, and still pretty much with the patricians and gentlemen who took the lead in gaining American independence and forming a new national government. Such identification with the founding also explains Mencken's opposition of and ridicule for the New Deal and the federal agencies it has secured as a seemingly permanent feature of American life. Those two notions themselves, the founding and opposition to the New Deal, are enough to put Mencken in the conservative camp, since the post-World War II conservative movement put those convictions on its banner. What finally prevents conservatives from including Mencken under their political tent is his lack of faith and his temerity in praising Nietzsche. No one with good sense, ... could actually approve of Nietzsche. Even Lears explored favorably late 19th century neo-medievalism in America. He did that in one of his books. Noticed that Mencken, by the end of his life, ran aground on the shoals of his own agnosticism. For Mencken, like his late Victorian predecessors, the only alternative to religious or secular humanism was, as Lears puts it, a mechanistic materialism that was nearly as arrogant in its human-centeredness, in its assumption that human science had already cracked the code of the cosmos. End of quote. Without finally asserting that he deserved the suffering of his last years, Lears does insinuate that Mencken had it coming. Quote, Mencken's own stroke was the final demonstration of that cruelty and idiocy. It was one of the harsh and meaningless fiats of destiny. He found in Conrad's stories a destiny undreamt of in positivist optimism. Mencken, the maestro of language, was destined to end his days groping for words and forgetting the names of his closest friends. When I see God, he would tell visitors, I'm going to speak sharply to him. Nothing in this life became Mencken like the close of it. End of quote. The same goes for Mencken's conservatism. Nothing in his political outlook became him like being excluded from the ranks of conservatives.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, Bob. Thank you, Darrell. Thank you to our distinguished audience and our international audience on Zoom. I'm going to perform an act of anachronism. So I hope this doesn't call forth the Comstock Commission and other federal. I think that history is inevitably anachronistic. You're talking about past events. The trick is to try to learn, speculate, maybe learn a little something about current conditions and current society through the lens of the past. But the trick is to speculate, but not to go over, trespass into presentism and just assume that the past is the same as the present. So I'm going to do a little speculation. I'm going to do a little personal reflection and things that strike me within the bounds, I hope, of the subject. I think I'll start off with when I was a kid and the Middle Ages. And it's not true that the big disputations were around how many angels could fit on the head of a pin. No. The raging contention centered on realism versus nominalism, epistemological realism versus epistemological nominalism. And basically, realists believe that the Platonic expression of what the words describe is a manifestation of the universal and immutable. Nominalists believe that words are notational, that the object or concepts they describe derive their reality from their description, and thus are subject to changeable definitions. So holding that in mind, ever since I was in college, I was disconcerted, and as I'm prone to be, maybe it's why I kind of like Mencken and deeply irritated at things, by the misuse, in my opinion, in the media and discourse, general discourse of political terms, especially conservative. The proliferation of oxymoronic or contradictory conjunctions like conservative revolutionary exacerbated my unease.